From illegalization of drunk driving, criminalization of domestic violence, creation of 911 emergency telephone number, do you ever just sit alone and wonder how some of these laws and social services in the world came to be, and you're left scratching your head wondering what prompted their formation? Well, you're not alone. By tracing the connections between many legal reforms, I made some astonishing findings. It might surprise you to hear that a good number of social services and laws we enjoy in our lives today were triggered into existence by the worst of humanity's wrongs, crimes. So I compiled a list of the most fascinating crimes that changed our world for all of you inquisitive like me. Enough faffing, let's roll. If you've gone through any psychology textbook, then it's likely that you've come across the term bystander effect, commonly known as Genov syndrome. It is a socio-psychological theory that states that an individual's likelihood of helping decreases when passive bystanders are present in an emergency situation. According to the effect, one of the psychological processes that prevents a bystander from helping a person in distress is the diffusion of responsibility, where the bystander will feel less prompted to intervene in emergency situations as the size of the group increases, since they feel less personal responsibility. This in turn reinforces mutual denial. The term Genov syndrome was coined after a 28-year-old bartender, Catherine Genov, was murdered as 37 people watched, or so the story goes. On the morning of March 13, 1964, at around 2 a.m., Catherine Genov, a resident of Kew Gardens in Queens, New York, is driving home from work, eager to see her girlfriend on their first anniversary. But a necrophiliac and mentally defective father of 3, Winston Mosley, is trailing her. After arriving home and parking her car in the parking lot, Mosley approaches her with a hunting knife in his hand and stabs her twice in the back before retreating to his vehicle when a neighbor scares him off after hearing Genov's cries for help. The wounds are severe but not fatal, so she gets back on her feet and makes for the building's entrance where she falls unconscious right before the stairs. Mosley returns after around 10 minutes, covering his face with a wide-brimmed hat, and finds Genov lying barely conscious in the hallway. Now away from the sight of neighbors and passers-by, he proceeds to stab her repeatedly before raping her and making away with $49 from her purse. Most of the neighbors are awake by now after the first commotion, but just witness from their windows as poor Genovese is being knifed to death amid her cries for help. For more than 35 minutes, 37 respectable and law-abiding citizens in Queens watched a killer stalk and stab a woman in separate attacks in Kew Gardens. But why? I didn't want to get involved, one neighbor revealed during investigations. It was more than just a tabloid murder, it was a morality tale. A petulant exhibit of the argument that cities were dehumanizing and alienating, that there was no such thing as neighborhood, community, or togetherness, that people were cruel, indifferent, and selfish. It was this shocking death and the cold behavior portrayed by the resident of Queens that inspired the creation of a central emergency number, where witnesses could report crimes and tragedies without necessarily feeling compelled to offer direct help, if at all they didn't feel like. And that's how America's emergency service, 911, came to be. Hey, before we move on to the next reform, kindly consider subscribing if you're new here and give the video a thumbs up. Thank you. Drunk driving has been around since the end of the 19th century. On September 10, 1897, a 25-year-old London-based taxi driver named George Smith became the very first person ever to be arrested for drunk driving after he slammed his cab into a wall in New Bond Street. Smith was arrested and arraigned in court where he pleaded guilty and was fined 25 shillings. In the United States, the first laws against operating a motor vehicle while under the influence of alcohol were passed in the jurisdiction of New York in 1910. California was the next state to outlaw drunk driving, and other states falling between their borders soon followed to pass their legislation as well. However, the laws were not stringent and tended to be fairly general in concept, and there was no clear definition of what exactly drunk driving was, and any fatalities resulting to drunk driving were seen as a normal accident that unfortunately couldn't be prevented. It was not until 1980 when a crime sparked the need for public awareness about the dangers of drinking and driving, and the authorities began to get tough on offenders. On May 3, 1980, 13-year-old Carrie Lightner of California is walking along a quiet road when a car swerves out of control, hits her from behind and throws her 125 feet away. The driver does not stop to render help, nor does he tell anyone of his actions. Instead, he speeds off, and in a pool of blood and excruciating pain, Carrie is left on the road to die. The culprit, Clarence Bush, is soon identified and apprehended by the police. They find that he has 3 prior records of arrest for intoxication and has in fact been out on bail from another hit-and-run drunk driving crash, one that he had committed barely 4 days earlier. Yet somehow he is still driving on a valid California driver's license. Candy Lightner Carrie's mother learns from the police that drunk driving is rarely prosecuted harshly and Bush is unlikely to spend significant time behind bars. She is furious and decides to take action against what she later termed as the only socially accepted form of homicide. She forms Mothers Against Drunk Driving, an organization that was aimed at mobilizing drunk driving victims and their allies to establish public conviction that impaired driving is unacceptable and criminal. Bush is prosecuted, but despite the fact that he killed a child, left the scene and had numerous priors, he is only sentenced for 2 years and only for vehicular homicide. His full license is returned to him upon his release just 18 months later. He proves to be a habitual and persistent criminal when shortly after his release, he hits another girl. In 1980 alone, the year Carrie Lightner died, the USA recorded some 27,500 alcohol-related traffic fatalities, which includes 2,500 in California alone. And Candy Lightner decides to lobby Jerry Brown, the then California's governor, into setting up a task force to investigate drunk driving. In 1981, California passes a law imposing minimum fines of $375 for drunk drivers and a mandatory imprisonment for up to 4 years for repeat offenders. President Ronald Reagan soon asked Candy to serve on the National Commission on Drunk Driving, which recommends raising the minimum drinking age to 21, but most states are not willing to comply. In July 1984, the president signs a law reducing federal highway grants to any states that fails to raise its drinking age to 21, and by the end of the following year, all the 50 states had cooperated. That is not all. Mudd went on to wage a campaign to lower the nation's blood alcohol content from 0.1% to 0.08. The group wins a major victory in 2000 when Clinton administration passed a no-time federal highway funds to states' adoption of the 0.08 standard. By the time the organization was celebrating its 20th anniversary, alcohol-related fatalities in the US had dropped by an incredible 40%, and the states with the toughest drunk driving laws had begun treating alcohol-related fatalities as murder. On July 31st, 1986, a 15-year-old schoolgirl, Dawn Ashworth, leaves for home from a friend's house in the village of Narborough, Leicestershire. She chooses to take a shortcut along a footpath known as 10 Pond Lane, and then she vanishes. It's not until 2 days later that her body is discovered in the corner of a field nearby, covered in twigs and branches. The medical examiner quickly establishes that she was defiled before being strangled. Her death is very similar to that of Linda Mann, also a 15-year-old schoolgirl that had been killed 2.5 years ago on November 21, 1983, about a mile from where Dawn's body was found, and soon the police realized the murders were committed by the same culprit. The killer had left not an atom of evidence that could be used to link anyone with the murders at that time, and with growing public pressure, the campaign to hunt for the criminal soon takes a religious turn, with religious leaders publicly shaming the act, urging the murderer to surrender himself to the authorities. But the killer is never coaxed. A 17-year-old boy with learning difficulties, Richard Buckland, is soon arrested as a suspect, but refuses to confess to either of the murders. The police, in the certainty that the girls were murdered by the same person, are convinced he's lying. Meanwhile, at the University of Leicester, a geneticist, Alec Jeffreys, has made a remarkable yet accidental discovery during a failed experiment to study the way inherited diseases pass through families. He had extracted DNA from cells and attached it to photographic film. The extracted film showed a sequence of bars, and he quickly realizes that every individual whose cells had been used in the experiment could be identified with great precision. He therefore concludes that the technique could also be used to determine kinship. After publishing an academic paper about his discovery, he is asked to assist with a number of immigration cases, where several children were being denied British citizenship because immigration officials were disputing they were the offspring of British parents. But the technique had not yet been used in criminal investigations, and when he first states during a talk about his discovery that it could be used to delink or link criminals to a crime, some of the audience laughed out loud. After Richard Buckland appeared for a court session, Jeffries receives an unexpected call from the police asking him to prove that Buckland had murdered Dawn and Linda, or either. He agrees to carry out the tests, and with Buckland's blood and semen from the 2 dead girls, he works through the night to finish the work. By studying the extracted films, he sees that the girls had been defiled by the same man, and also that Buckland's DNA is completely different. The police are astonished and initially reluctant to believe what he's saying. The tests are run for a second time and then for a third time, and now the police are convinced but somehow disappointed. The next month, the detectives decide that the technique that had been used to exonerate Richard Buckland should be used to catch the killer. And since there is no DNA database, they would screen the entire neighborhood and compare the DNA sequences with those from the semen. They set an operation to gather DNA of every man in the area. Letters are sent to every male born between 1953 and 1970 and who lived or worked in Narborough area in recent years, asking them to give a blood sample. It is a voluntary scheme, and as expected, a few men decline. Some saying they don't like needles, and others saying they don't like police officers. The horror of the crimes and the fear that the killer could strike again results in those with such reservation to succumb under societal pressure. After 8 months, 5,511 men had given blood samples and only one had refused, but unfortunately there is still no match with the semen samples. The killer is only caught more than a year since Don Ashworth was killed. In August 1987, a baker named Kelly is having a pint with a few friends in a pub in Leicester. He confesses to having impersonated Colin Pitchfork, a colleague in the same bakery, in order to take the blood test on his behalf. Kelly explains that Pitchfork had asked for this favor because he had already taken the test for a friend who had a conviction of indecent exposure when he was young. Pitchfork had doctored his passport, inserted Kelly's photograph, and then driven him to the test center, waiting outside while the blood sample was taken. 6 weeks later, one of the workers in the pub relayed this information to the police, and both Kelly and Pitchfork are promptly arrested. Colin Pitchfork's DNA testing is conducted, and voila, it's a match with that of the semen sample. He confesses to the murders and is jailed for a minimum of 30 years. He is later granted parole and released on September 2021, but is recalled to prison in November of the same year for breaching his license condition by approaching young women. Domestic violence, especially one directed towards women and children, is as ageless as the strings of death and has been around since recorded history. It was an acceptable way of life and an exhibit of patriarchal dominance, and what followed was appropriate attitude towards women and children. In the US, during most of the 1900s, domestic violence was acknowledged but treated as a private matter. The American criminal justice system did not perceive domestic violence as a crime, not even as a problem, though the influence of the women's liberation movement in 1960s and 1970s did a great job in educating the public about the gravity of the matter and enforced the formation of a few anti-domestic violence laws. It was not until 1983 when a crime helped change the stand of the public for the better and tighten existing laws. In 1982, Tracy Thurman leaves her husband Charles Thurman after a brief but violent marriage. She takes with her the only child, Charles Jr. She moves back to Connecticut, her hometown, while Buck remains in Florida. For 8 months, the couple live apart while Buck continually harassed Tracy and verbally threatened to kill her. When the threats of violence from Buck were too much, she appears at the Torrington police station to request for his arrest, but the police give various excuses for the inaction, including the officer who has your case is on vacation. For instance, when she attempted to obtain a restraining order against Buck, they refused to accept a criminal trespass from the homeowner.
I knew he was found, but some of the time he didn't approach me. He had told her that he was gonna take me into the woods. I wouldn't feel a thing. It'd be over with quickly. So he put in the fear into us that he was going to shoot me. And when I called the police department, they said there was nothing they can do because he wasn't bothering me.
On June 10, 1983, despite a restraining order, Buck arrives at the house Tracy is staying at and demands to see her. Tracy remains inside and contacts the police. 15 minutes later, with no police officer in sight, she decides to go outside the house and speak to Buck. It's only after 25 minutes after Tracy's call, a single officer arrives who sits in his car while Buck chases Tracy, grabs her by the hair, and stabs her over 20 times in the face, neck, and shoulders. Buck's boot prints mark her bruised and bloody face. He had sliced 3 holes in her esophagus. The officer eventually exits the car and takes the knife from Buck. While the officer watches, Buck kicks Tracy in the head several times, breaking her neck. By the time the police come, it's 40 minutes after she had made the call. She's loaded onto an ambulance and spends 8 months in hospital.
And Buck had come to the house wanting to talk to me. And I had a restraining order at the time. Called the police department. Said that he was there. And he says, no, you called the effing cops on me. And then at that point I saw Buck go into his back pocket. And that's when it dawned on me that he carried a knife. And then he grabbed me by the back of the hair. And next thing I knew, he stabbed me in the face. Then he threw me down on the ground and stabbed me in the back of the neck. And I heard Buck go upstairs. And he grabbed our son and came down and stomped on my face, broke my neck, said, I killed your effing mother.
Due to the injuries suffered, she is now partially and permanently paralyzed. Buck is convicted of assault and sentenced to 20 years, but serves less than 8 years in prison. Now out of hospital, she, with the help of an attorney, files a lawsuit in 1984. She becomes the first woman in America to sue a town individually and its police department for violating her civil rights, claiming the police ignored the violence because she was married to the perpetrator. She wins the case and is awarded $1.9 million.
There wasn't a personal attack on me from the police department. I mean, they just weren't trained for that. Back then, they just handled everything differently than they handle it now. To begin with, I was really angry at what happened to me. I was angry with the police department for a long time. You know, I'm not gonna ever be the same physically, emotionally. I mean, just that one day changed my son's whole life.
The range back unleashed that afternoon brought the largely ignored issue of domestic violence to national attention. The lawsuit brought about sweeping national reform of domestic violence laws, including the Daman Law, also known as the Family Violence and Prevention Act, which mandates police to make arrests in domestic violence cases even when the victim does not wish to press charges, and to arrest the abuser, contrary to before. Tracy Thurman case exposed the inadequacies of domestic violence laws and the absence of support networks for victims. Though currently disfigured and permanently disabled, she is positive that her case has helped many women in violent marriages access much-needed legal help.
9 out of 10 times the warning signs are there. Just listen to your instincts. Don't ignore the warning signs, because they're there. And when you see the warning signs are there, get out. Get out before it's too late. And I know there's that fear. I know what that fear is like. I just wouldn't want to see anybody go through what I went through. Or even worse, not be here to talk about it.
It is unbelievable that most of these reforms were implemented in the not-so-distant past. Thus, prior to the change, the society accepted this state of affairs as perhaps regrettable but tolerable. What is that thing that you think in the not-so-distant future our successors will find appalling and unacceptable that we as a society are presently quite willing to tolerate?